Some people chase power every night. Others chase peace. But the most feared man in the city returned to the same quiet bar for a reason no one could ever guess. At exactly 9 o'clock every evening, when the streets of downtown Chicago began glowing beneath rows of amber streetlights, and the city's restless heartbeat slowed into the rhythm of nightlife, a black Rolls-Royce Phantom eased to the curb outside an old jazz bar tucked between two modern office towers. It was never early. It was never late. 9 o'clock every single night. The valet never asked for the keys anymore because the driver already knew where to park. The bartender never looked surprised because the order never changed. The pianist quietly nodded without looking toward the entrance because he already knew who had arrived. Adrian Romano stepped inside with the same calm confidence that made conversations pause without anyone realizing why. At 34 years old, he carried himself with effortless authority, broad shoulders filling a tailored charcoal suit while faint lines of ink disappeared beneath the crisp collar of his white shirt. His dark brown skin reflected the warm glow of hanging Edison bulbs as he removed his coat and walked across polished hardwood floors without the slightest hurry. No bodyguards surrounded him. No assistants announced his name. He never demanded attention. Somehow attention simply followed him. The hostess smiled politely before leading him toward the table she no longer needed to ask about. It was always the corner beside the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the quiet street, far enough from the stage to disappear into the shadows yet close enough to hear every note without interference. His chair remained angled exactly the same every evening, giving him a perfect view of the small stage illuminated beneath soft golden lights. Before Adrian even opened the leather menu, a crystal glass and a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon appeared on the table. No questions. No suggestions. Just the familiar vintage he preferred every night. The bartender poured exactly 5 ounces into the glass before quietly stepping away. Adrian lifted the wine, studying its deep crimson color as if greeting an old friend, then placed it gently back onto the table without taking a sip. Across the room, employees continued preparing for another busy night. Servers balanced polished trays through narrow aisles while couples settled into booths beneath vintage photographs of Chicago's jazz legends. Laughter drifted softly through the room, blending with the gentle tuning of a saxophone. Then the overhead lights dimmed. Conversations naturally softened. A single spotlight slowly came alive above the stage. Emily Carter stepped forward carrying nothing more than a silver microphone and a quiet smile. Her shoulder-length wavy blonde hair rested neatly against a simple black dress that matched the timeless elegance of the room. She looked nothing like the glamorous celebrities filling downtown billboards. There was no dramatic entrance, no extravagant performance waiting to happen. She simply smiled at the audience with the kind of warmth that couldn't be rehearsed. During the day she carried trays between crowded tables, refilled coffee cups, memorized regular customers' favorite meals, and thanked every guest as though each dollar mattered because it truly did. Every evening she traded her waitress apron for a microphone and sang classic jazz standards for anyone willing to listen. Most customers noticed her beautiful voice. Others noticed her graceful smile. Adrian noticed something entirely different. The first note floated gently through the room like warm light breaking through a rainy afternoon. The pianist followed with delicate chords while the upright bass quietly joined beneath the melody. Emily closed her eyes for only a second before opening them again, singing with a sincerity untouched by ambition or performance. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't chasing applause. She sang as though every lyric belonged to someone she loved. Adrian finally lifted the wine to his lips, taking a slow sip without looking away from the stage. Around him, waiters hurried between tables, glasses clinked softly, and conversations resumed in hushed voices. Yet his attention never wandered. Night after night, song after song, he returned to this exact chair with the same glass of Cabernet Sauvignon, watching the same young waitress become someone entirely different beneath the lights. The staff quietly exchanged curious glances whenever he arrived because none of them had ever seen the city's most mysterious businessman stay for an entire performance without entertaining guests, checking his phone, or discussing business. They assumed he admired the singer's beauty. They whispered that perhaps he was lonely. Some believed he was quietly planning to buy the bar. None of them understood that Adrian Romano had never returned because of the wine, the music, or even the beautiful waitress standing beneath the spotlight. He kept returning because every time Emily began to sing, She awakened a memory he had spent years trying and failing to forget. Emily Carter never noticed the quiet ritual unfolding around her, because life had taught her that ordinary people rarely had the luxury of paying attention to who sat in the corner of a crowded room. Every morning her alarm rang at 6 o'clock inside a modest apartment on the north side of Chicago. She would quietly prepare breakfast, leave a handwritten note beside the medicine organizer on the kitchen counter, and check once more that everything her father might need during the day remained within easy reach. Ever since the accident 18 months earlier had left him recovering through long months of physical therapy, every dollar Emily earned carried a purpose far greater than herself. Hospital bills rested in neat stacks inside a small drawer beside the refrigerator. Physical therapy appointments filled nearly every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. Rent was always due before she could think about buying anything new for herself. Even so, she never complained. By 10 o'clock each morning she tied on a black apron, tucked loose strands of her shoulder-length wavy blonde hair behind one ear, and welcomed lunchtime customers with the same warm smile she offered every stranger who entered the restaurant. The regulars adored her because she somehow remembered every favorite meal without writing a single note. Mr. Henderson always ordered grilled salmon without lemon. Mrs. Wallace preferred iced tea with exactly 2 slices of fresh lime. A retired firefighter named Frank insisted her smile made the coffee taste better, and Emily always laughed before reminding him that the coffee came from the same machine every day. Kindness had become such a natural part of her that she no longer realized how unusual it truly was. When the lunch crowd finally disappeared, she helped clear empty tables even after her own shift technically ended. She polished silverware, folded linen napkins, and thanked every coworker before disappearing into the small dressing room behind the kitchen. A few minutes later she returned wearing the elegant black dress she reserved for evening performances. The transformation was subtle rather than dramatic. She looked like the same woman, only quieter somehow, as though the music allowed the truest version of herself to breathe. Across the city, Adrian Romano spent his afternoons inside glass offices where meetings filled every hour, and expensive watches quietly measured conversations that rarely carried genuine emotion. His calendar remained packed weeks in advance, yet every evening after the final appointment ended, he instructed his driver to follow the familiar route downtown without exception. The chauffeur never needed directions. The destination had become part of the schedule, no different from sunrise or sunset. Adrian often stared through the tinted window as familiar streets drifted past, saying almost nothing during the drive. His phone remained silent on the leather seat beside him while unread messages accumulated from executives, attorneys, and associates hoping for a reply. None of them understood that there was exactly 1 hour each night that Adrian refused to surrender to business. It belonged entirely to a quiet jazz bar hidden beneath glowing lights, and the woman whose voice somehow reached places inside him that success never could. Inside the restaurant, employees had begun inventing harmless theories to explain their mysterious customer. Some believed he had once been a musician. Others guessed he had lost someone important because of the distant expression that appeared whenever Emily sang slower songs. The younger servers secretly competed for the chance to deliver his wine, hoping for a generous tip, only to discover he politely requested that Emily continue bringing his glass whenever she had a free moment. She always approached with the same professional courtesy, placing the Cabernet Sauvignon gently on the polished table before wishing him a pleasant evening. Their conversations never lasted more than a few seconds. Sometimes he thanked her. Sometimes she wished him an enjoyable performance. Sometimes neither of them spoke at all. Yet each exchange carried an unusual sense of peace that lingered long after she returned to the stage. Emily believed she was simply serving another quiet customer. Adrian knew he was witnessing something the world had almost forgotten. A person who treated every stranger with equal dignity, whether they wore an expensive tailored suit or a worn denim jacket. And without realizing it, both of them had already become part of a story neither one had intended to begin. The routine continued so perfectly that even time itself seemed to respect it. Monday looked no different from Friday. Rainy evenings felt almost identical to clear autumn nights. At precisely 9 o'clock, Adrian Romano would walk through the front door, offer the hostess a quiet nod, cross the polished wooden floor, and settle into the familiar chair beside the window. The bartender no longer reached for the wine list because the bottle was already waiting at the perfect temperature. Emily would arrive a few moments later carrying the crystal glass with steady hands and the same sincere smile she offered everyone else. "Good evening, Mr. Romano." "Good evening, Emily." Those simple words became the beginning of every evening, repeated so naturally that neither of them questioned the tradition anymore. Around them the city changed with the seasons. Leaves turned from green to brilliant shades of orange before disappearing beneath the first snowfall. Holiday decorations appeared along the streets outside while soft white lights reflected against the restaurant windows. Couples celebrated anniversaries. Families gathered for birthdays. Business executives signed contracts over expensive dinners. Through every celebration and every ordinary evening, one thing remained constant. Adrian always occupied the corner table whenever Emily performed. The employees began noticing details that most customers overlooked. Adrian never interrupted her singing by checking his phone. He never scheduled meetings during her performances. If an important call arrived, he quietly silenced it without hesitation. Sometimes he barely touched his Cabernet Sauvignon until the final song had ended. Other nights he slowly enjoyed the wine while watching the stage with the peaceful expression of someone who had finally escaped the weight of the outside world. Emily, however, remained wonderfully unaware of the quiet mystery surrounding him. She believed he simply appreciated jazz music more than most guests. During breaks between songs she refilled water glasses, delivered desserts, and greeted newcomers with cheerful warmth before returning to the microphone when the pianist signaled the next set. One Thursday evening an elderly couple entered the restaurant shortly before every table became occupied. The hostess apologized softly, explaining that reservations had filled the dining room. The disappointed husband smiled kindly and whispered that they could come back another night, because it was their 50th wedding anniversary, and they had hoped to hear the live music together. Emily overheard the conversation while carrying a tray of fresh coffee. Before she could think of a solution, Adrian quietly stood from his chair, approached the hostess, and spoke only a few calm words. Moments later the elderly couple found themselves seated beside the window at the very table Adrian occupied every evening. Confused, the husband thanked him repeatedly, but Adrian only smiled politely before moving to a smaller table farther away without the slightest concern. Emily watched the exchange from across the room with genuine surprise. Most wealthy customers insisted on keeping the best seats. Adrian had surrendered his favorite place without even being asked. When she carried his wine to the smaller table she could not hide her curiosity. "Thank you for doing that," she said softly. Adrian glanced toward the smiling couple listening to the pianist tune another melody. "Some memories deserve the better view," he replied. Emily smiled, touched by the simple answer, before returning to the stage. She did not realize those few words remained in her thoughts long after the restaurant closed that evening. As weeks quietly passed, she found herself searching for the familiar corner whenever she entered the dining room before her performance. If the chair remained empty, something felt strangely incomplete even though she barely knew the man sitting there each night. She reminded herself that customers came and went every day, yet Adrian never seemed like an ordinary customer anymore. He had become part of the room itself, as familiar as the piano, the polished bar, or the warm golden lights hanging from the ceiling. One evening the head bartender finally laughed as he wiped clean another wine glass. "I have worked here for almost 20 years, he whispered to another server, "and I have never seen anyone return this faithfully for music alone." Emily overheard the remark and simply smiled before gently shaking her head. "Maybe some people just appreciate consistency," she answered. The bartender chuckled without replying, but Adrian happened to hear her words from across the room. For the first time in many years, a faint smile reached his eyes before Emily stepped beneath the spotlight once again. Completely unaware that the consistency she spoke of had quietly become the brightest part of someone else's life. Winter settled gently over Chicago, wrapping the city in crisp evenings and shimmering reflections that danced across rain-soaked sidewalks. But inside the little jazz bar the warmth never changed. Soft golden lights glowed against polished wood. Familiar melodies floated through the air. And every night Emily Carter greeted strangers with the same genuine kindness that had quietly become the soul of the restaurant. To most customers she was simply a beautiful waitress who happened to sing beautifully. No one noticed the little sacrifices hidden between her smiles because kindness rarely announced itself. It simply appeared when no one was paying attention. Adrian Romano noticed. One snowy Tuesday evening, after the final applause faded and the last guest slowly drifted toward the exit, Adrian remained seated with only a small amount of Cabernet Sauvignon still resting in his crystal glass. He never rushed to leave. He seemed content listening to the quiet sounds that followed closing time. The clinking of dishes, the laughter of exhausted employees, and the gentle hum of the espresso machine preparing one final cup of coffee. Through the large front window he watched Emily step outside wearing a simple wool coat and wrapping a scarf around her neck before disappearing into the cold. His driver approached the curb as usual, but Adrian surprised him with a calm wave. "Go ahead. I will walk for a while." The driver nodded without asking questions. Adrian slipped his hands into his coat pockets and followed several yards behind, never intending to interrupt her evening. Emily crossed 2 quiet blocks before stopping beneath the glowing lights of a 24-hour pharmacy. She entered for only a few minutes before leaving with a small paper bag carefully held against her chest. Adrian assumed she was heading home until she unexpectedly turned toward St. Mary's Rehabilitation Hospital instead. Curious, he continued walking at a respectful distance. Through the lobby windows he watched Emily greet the overnight receptionist by name before riding the elevator upstairs. Nearly 40 minutes later she emerged again, this time carrying an empty coffee cup and wearing the same peaceful smile she always wore after finishing a song. There was exhaustion in her eyes, but there was also quiet contentment. She was not visiting because someone expected her to. She visited because someone needed her. Adrian never entered the hospital that night. He simply watched her leave before turning back toward the waiting car. The following evening Emily arrived at the restaurant as though nothing unusual had happened. She welcomed guests, carried trays across the dining room, and later stepped beneath the spotlight with the same graceful confidence that had become her signature. Adrian studied her differently now. He realized that every smile customers admired had been carried through sleepless nights and endless responsibilities that no one else ever noticed. A week later another quiet discovery unfolded without either of them planning it. During a short break between performances Emily walked into the kitchen carrying a container filled with leftovers that would normally be discarded after closing. She politely asked the chef if she could take them instead of throwing them away. The chef smiled and agreed without hesitation because she made the same request almost every evening. Curious, Adrian happened to glance outside after finishing his wine. Across the street an elderly man sat bundled beneath a bus shelter, quietly reading a worn paperback novel while waiting for the late-night route. Emily crossed the street carrying the neatly packed meal and a cup of hot soup. She crouched beside him, spoke with him for several minutes, laughed at something he said, and wished him a wonderful evening before returning to work as though the moment required no recognition. She never looked around to see whether anyone had noticed. She never mentioned it to her coworkers. She simply continued serving customers with the same cheerful energy she had displayed since the doors first opened that morning. Adrian remained motionless beside the window, his untouched glass reflecting the soft lights above the bar. In the world he knew, generosity often arrived with cameras, speeches, or expectations of gratitude. Emily asked for none of those things. Her compassion existed even when she believed she was completely alone. As she returned to the stage moments later and adjusted the silver microphone before beginning another timeless jazz standard, Adrian understood something that had quietly escaped him for years. He had not been returning night after night because he was searching for comfort. He had been returning because every evening this remarkable young woman reminded him that genuine goodness still existed in a world that too often forgot how to recognize it. By the time spring arrived, the quiet rhythm that had connected their evenings had become so familiar that neither Adrian nor Emily realized how much it had already changed them. Outside, the last patches of snow disappeared beneath warm sunshine, and people filled the sidewalks with lighter coats and brighter conversations. Inside the jazz bar, however, the atmosphere remained timeless. Soft piano melodies drifted through the dining room, candlelight reflected across polished wine glasses, and every evening Emily welcomed another room full of strangers who would leave believing they had simply enjoyed dinner and live music. They never understood they had witnessed something much rarer. Adrian arrived precisely at 9 o'clock as always. The hostess smiled before he even reached the entrance. His Cabernet Sauvignon was uncorked before he removed his coat. Emily carried the familiar crystal glass to his table, placing it gently beside him with the effortless grace she had repeated countless evenings before. "Good evening, Mr. Romano." "Good evening, Emily." Their conversation might have ended there, just like every other night, but Emily hesitated for a brief moment before speaking again. "Would you like to hear anything special tonight?" Adrian looked at her with quiet surprise. It was the first personal question she had ever asked him. He lowered his eyes toward the wine before answering almost in a whisper. "Only if you already know it." Emily smiled. "I know a lot of old songs." Adrian remained silent for several seconds. His fingers rested lightly against the stem of the glass while memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit quietly returned. "Moon River," he finally replied. "If it is not too much trouble." Emily nodded warmly. "I have not sung that one in a while, but I will do my best." She walked back toward the stage, unaware that a single song had just opened a door Adrian had kept locked for nearly 2 decades. As the pianist softly introduced the melody, Adrian closed his eyes for the first time since entering the restaurant. The opening notes floated gently across the room, delicate and familiar. Emily's voice entered with remarkable tenderness, carrying every lyric with quiet sincerity instead of dramatic performance. She did not imitate famous singers. She simply told the story hidden inside the music. Adrian barely touched his wine. His attention remained fixed on the stage while another memory slowly unfolded in his mind. He was only 9 years old again, sitting beside an old upright piano inside a modest brick house on the south side of Chicago. His mother smiled as evening sunlight poured through lace curtains, gently singing the very same song while preparing dinner. She believed music could calm every troubled heart. No matter how difficult life became, she ended every evening with a melody instead of a complaint. Adrian had not heard anyone sing it that way since the day she passed away. Countless professional performers had covered the song through the years, but none had captured the quiet warmth his mother carried in every note. Until now. Emily finished the final verse, and for several heartbeats the restaurant remained completely silent before gentle applause filled the room. She thanked the audience with her usual humble smile and stepped away from the microphone. Adrian did not applaud immediately. His hands remained folded quietly together as he stared into the fading spotlight, gathering emotions he had spent years teaching himself to hide. When Emily later approached to refill his glass, she noticed something unusual. His eyes appeared softer than she had ever seen them. "I hope it was all right," she said with a gentle smile. Adrian looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You reminded me of someone I have missed every day of my life." Emily's expression softened immediately. She did not ask another question because she sensed the memory deserved silence more than curiosity. Instead, she simply placed the bottle back onto the table and quietly replied, "Then I am honored that the song found you tonight." Adrian watched her return to the stage, realizing she had offered comfort without asking for explanations, without expecting gratitude, and without even knowing the wound she had quietly touched. In that moment he finally understood the truth he had been unwilling to admit even to himself. He had never been searching for beautiful music alone. He had been searching for the feeling of home, and somehow the woman standing beneath those warm golden lights had gently brought a small piece of it back into his life. The evening began like every other evening, wrapped in warm amber light and gentle piano melodies that floated through the jazz bar like old memories refusing to fade. Outside, a light spring rain covered the sidewalks with shimmering reflections, while inside the dining room every table slowly filled with familiar laughter and quiet conversations. Emily Carter welcomed each guest with the same graceful smile, balancing trays effortlessly before stepping onto the small stage. As the first spotlight illuminated the microphone, Adrian Romano watched from his usual table beside the window, his glass of Cabernet Sauvignon resting untouched before him. He had already learned that the first song always belonged to the audience, but the second somehow belonged to him. Emily began singing with the calm sincerity that had become the heartbeat of the room, and once again the restaurant settled into peaceful silence. Halfway through the performance, however, the front door opened, allowing a burst of louder voices to interrupt the gentle atmosphere. A group of well-dressed young professionals entered together, laughing enthusiastically after what appeared to have been a successful corporate celebration. They greeted one another warmly, accepted a large table near the stage, and ordered expensive dinners with bottles of sparkling wine. At first they blended naturally into the evening, enjoying the music while exchanging stories from work. But as more glasses were poured and conversations grew livelier, one member of the group began speaking loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "She is too talented to be carrying dinner plates," he joked with a careless grin while nodding toward Emily after she finished another song and returned to serving guests. Several people at the table chuckled politely. Emily pretended not to hear. She had learned long ago that not every careless comment deserved a response. A few minutes later another guest smiled and called her over while she refilled water. "Glasses. You really should be somewhere bigger than this place," the woman said. "You have a beautiful voice. Why waste it waiting tables?" Emily thanked her kindly before replying with her usual warmth. "This place gave me an opportunity when I needed one. I am grateful to be here." Her answer surprised the woman, who simply smiled and nodded. But one man leaned back in his chair with an amused expression. "Grateful is nice," he said. "Still, if I looked like you, I would find something much more glamorous." The words were spoken carelessly rather than cruelly, yet they carried the quiet assumption that dignity depended on status instead of character. Emily's smile never disappeared. "I think every honest job deserves respect," she answered gently. "I like making people feel welcome." The table grew unexpectedly quiet. One guest lowered her eyes, clearly uncomfortable. Another shifted in his chair before changing the subject. Emily excused herself politely and continued serving nearby customers exactly as she always had. From across the room Adrian had observed every moment without interrupting. His expression never changed. He simply watched Emily continue her work with the same calm professionalism she had shown every evening since the first time he walked through those doors. There was no resentment in her voice, no embarrassment in her posture, only quiet confidence that needed no defense. When she returned to the stage for the final performance of the evening, something remarkable happened. The entire dining room seemed to listen more carefully than ever before. Her voice carried a deeper tenderness, filling every corner of the restaurant with gentle emotion that gradually softened even the loudest conversations. The group near the stage slowly stopped talking altogether. The man who had made the careless remark looked toward Emily with a different expression now, one touched less by amusement and more by reflection. As the final note lingered in the air, spontaneous applause echoed throughout the room, lasting longer than usual. Emily bowed her head with humble gratitude before stepping away from the microphone. Adrian finally lifted his glass and took a slow sip. He had witnessed countless displays of influence throughout his life, but none impressed him as deeply as quiet dignity. Emily had not defended herself with arguments or anger. She had simply remained true to the person she was, allowing kindness to speak louder than pride. And somehow, without asking anyone to change, she had gently changed the entire room. The conversation sparked by Emily's quiet response lingered in the restaurant long after the last customers had finished dessert. Over the following week, something subtle began to change. Guests who had once hurried through dinner now stayed for the final song. Regular customers started requesting tables near the stage days in advance. Several people even brought friends after describing the little jazz bar as the place where music somehow made the entire city feel slower. Emily noticed the growing crowds but credited the talented pianist, the excellent food, and the welcoming atmosphere created by the staff. She never imagined that many people returned because they remembered the grace with which she treated every person who walked through the door. Adrian continued arriving precisely at 9 o'clock, settling into whichever table remained available since he had given up insisting on the corner seat after the elderly couple's anniversary. The staff often tried to reserve it for him anyway, but he politely declined whenever another guest could enjoy it more. Emily quietly admired that about him. There was something unusually peaceful about a man who clearly possessed influence yet never felt the need to display it. One evening, shortly before the first performance began, the restaurant manager approached Emily with an excited smile. "Someone left this for you." He handed her a neatly folded envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note on simple cream-colored paper. "Thank you for reminding strangers that kindness still matters. Keep singing." Emily read the message twice before carefully placing it inside the pocket of her apron. She assumed it had come from one of the regular guests, And the thoughtful words stayed with her throughout the evening. Across the room, Adrian noticed the quiet smile that appeared as she slipped the note away. He said nothing. Only his longtime driver knew that Adrian had written it himself before sunrise that morning after spending an hour searching for the right words. He had rewritten the message 4 times because compliments about beauty or talent felt too small. What he truly admired was something much deeper. Later that evening, after the final applause faded, Emily gathered empty glasses while Adrian prepared to leave. As she reached his table, she noticed the familiar bottle was still nearly full. "You hardly touched your wine tonight," she observed with a gentle laugh. Adrian looked toward the stage where the spotlight had already gone dark. "Some evenings leave you full enough without finishing the glass." Emily smiled, amused by the thoughtful answer. "You always say things that sound like they belong in old movies." Adrian laughed quietly, surprising both of them. It was a genuine laugh, soft and unguarded, the kind that seemed unfamiliar even to himself. "Perhaps I have watched too many old movies." Their eyes met for a brief moment before another customer called Emily's name from across the room. She excused herself with her usual warmth and hurried away, leaving Adrian standing beside the table longer than he intended. The bartender watched the exchange with growing curiosity. After Adrian departed, he walked over to Emily while polishing another wine glass. "You know," he said with a playful smile, "I have seen a lot of people walk through those doors over the years. Some come looking for entertainment. Some come looking for business. That man comes looking for peace." Emily looked toward the empty entrance where Adrian had disappeared only moments earlier. "He seems like someone carrying a heavy heart," she replied softly. The bartender nodded. "Maybe." He paused before adding, "Or maybe he finally found someone who helps him put it down for a little while." Emily did not answer. Instead, she unfolded the anonymous note once more before placing it carefully inside her purse rather than her apron. As she switched off the final stage light and watched the warm glow slowly fade across the empty room, she found herself wondering about the quiet man who always arrived with the same bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon and left without asking for anything except another evening of music. For the first time since they had met, she realized she was beginning to look forward to seeing him just as faithfully as he had always returned to see her. The anonymous note remained tucked safely inside Emily's purse, folded so carefully that its edges never bent. She had read it countless times during quiet moments between shifts, never knowing who had written it, yet somehow believing the words carried more sincerity than any compliment she had ever received. They reminded her that even ordinary kindness could leave extraordinary footprints in someone's life. That thought alone made the long hours feel lighter. The following Monday evening arrived with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of spring flowers through downtown Chicago. Emily finished arranging the last place settings before glancing almost instinctively toward the front entrance. The clock above the bar read 8:58. 2 minutes later, the familiar black Rolls-Royce appeared outside the window exactly as expected. Without realizing it, she smiled before returning to polish a stack of wine glasses. Adrian entered with the same composed expression, greeting the hostess before taking his seat. This time Emily walked to his table carrying the Cabernet Sauvignon before anyone asked her to. "I thought I would save everyone a few steps," she said with a quiet laugh as she placed the bottle beside him. Adrian looked up, pleasantly surprised. "Then I owe you my thanks." "You probably do," she replied playfully. "I am beginning to memorize your routine. And I suppose that makes me predictable." Emily smiled. Comfortably predictable. The simple exchange lasted only seconds, but it left both of them carrying an unfamiliar warmth throughout the evening. Later that night, after her second performance ended, Adrian remained seated while most guests applauded. Emily noticed he seemed unusually thoughtful. Instead of returning immediately backstage, she walked toward his table carrying a fresh pot of coffee. "Would you like coffee instead tonight?" she asked. Adrian glanced at the untouched wine before nodding. "Only if you are having one too after your shift." Emily laughed softly. "That sounds almost like an invitation." Adrian's expression briefly revealed uncertainty, as though he worried he had crossed an invisible line. "Only as two people sharing a quiet conversation," he answered honestly. "Nothing more." Emily studied him for a moment before smiling. "I think I would like that." Nearly an hour later, after the final customer had left and the chairs had been placed upside down on empty tables, the bartender poured 2 cups of freshly brewed coffee before quietly wishing them good night. The restaurant felt entirely different without music and conversation. The silence no longer seemed empty. It felt peaceful. They sat near the window watching light rain drift across the quiet street outside. For several minutes neither of them spoke. Surprisingly, the silence never became uncomfortable. Emily finally broke it with a gentle smile. "Can I ask you something?" Adrian nodded. "You have been coming here for months. You always order the same wine. You always sit quietly. You always listen more than you speak. What is it you are really looking for?" Adrian looked out the rain-covered window before answering with complete honesty. "For a long time I believed success meant never slowing down. Every day became another meeting, another responsibility, another decision. Then one evening I walked in here by accident and heard someone singing as though the world still had goodness left in it." Emily lowered her eyes, listening carefully. Adrian continued. "I realized I had forgotten what peace sounded like." Emily remained silent for several moments before speaking almost in a whisper. "I never imagined my songs could mean that much to anyone." Adrian smiled gently. "I do not return because you sing perfectly." Emily looked surprised. "You do not?" "No," he replied. "I return because every song reminds people to become the best version of themselves, including me." Emily felt her eyes grow unexpectedly warm. No compliment about her appearance had ever touched her the way those words did. Before either of them noticed the time, midnight had arrived. Emily stood and gathered the empty coffee cups with a grateful smile. "Thank you for staying." Adrian rose from his chair and quietly buttoned his coat. "No," he answered. "Thank you for giving me a place where I never have to pretend to be anyone else." As he stepped outside into the cool night air, Emily remained by the window watching the black Rolls-Royce disappear beneath rows of glowing streetlights. For the first time she understood that the quiet man who returned every evening had not simply become a familiar customer. Without either of them planning it, he had quietly become someone she hoped would walk through those doors again tomorrow. Summer arrived almost unnoticed, replacing cool evening breezes with warm air that drifted through the open doors of the little jazz bar, carrying the distant sounds of the city into the familiar room where so many quiet moments had unfolded. The golden light still reflected softly against polished hardwood floors, the piano still welcomed every guest with timeless melodies, and the same table near the window continued waiting each evening before 9 o'clock. Some traditions survive because people refused to let them disappear. Others survived because they quietly became part of someone's heart. Emily Carter stood backstage for a brief moment before her performance, gently unfolding the handwritten note she still carried inside her purse. The paper had softened from months of careful reading, but the words remained perfectly clear. "Thank you for reminding strangers that kindness still matters. Keep singing." She smiled before carefully folding it once more, never suspecting that the man sitting quietly beside the window had written every word. As always, Adrian Romano had arrived precisely on time. The familiar bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon rested beside his untouched glass, but tonight something felt different. Instead of watching only the stage, he found himself watching the people around him. Couples smiled more often. Friends listened more carefully. Strangers applauded with genuine warmth instead of polite obligation. Somehow one woman's kindness had transformed an ordinary restaurant into a place where people remembered how to slow down. Emily stepped beneath the spotlight and began singing the same classic melody that had first captured Adrian's attention many months earlier. Her voice carried through the room with quiet confidence, rich with sincerity rather than perfection, and every conversation gradually faded into respectful silence. Adrian closed his eyes for only a moment, allowing the music to settle gently into memories that no longer felt painful. For the first time in many years, remembering his mother no longer filled him with regret. It filled him with gratitude. When the final note faded, the audience rose together in a standing ovation. Emily looked almost embarrassed by the unexpected applause, thanking everyone with humble sincerity before stepping down from the stage. As the evening slowly came to an end and the last guests departed into the warm Chicago night, Adrian remained seated exactly where he always had. Emily approached carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee before he could ask. She placed one in front of him and smiled. I think tonight calls for coffee instead of wine. Adrian looked at the steaming cup before meeting her eyes with a grateful smile. I believe you are right. They sat together beside the window while the restaurant quietly settled into silence around them. Outside, the city continued rushing toward tomorrow. But inside, time seemed willing to wait a little longer. Emily glanced toward the familiar bottle still resting on the table. Can I ask you one last question? Adrian nodded. Of course. She smiled gently. Why did you really keep coming back all those nights? Adrian remained quiet for several seconds, searching not for impressive words but for honest ones. Finally, he looked toward the empty stage where the microphone still stood beneath a single warm light. When I first walked through those doors, I thought I was looking for a place to escape the noise of my life. He paused before continuing. Then I realized I was not escaping anything. I was coming back because every evening I watched someone choose kindness without expecting recognition. You reminded me that success means very little if it cannot make room for compassion. Emily listened without interrupting. Adrian smiled softly before adding the truth he had carried in his heart for months. People probably believed I returned because of the wine or the music. He shook his head almost imperceptibly. The wine was only a habit. The music opened the door. But you were the reason I never stopped coming back. Emily felt tears gently gather in her eyes. Not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization that the smallest acts she had considered ordinary had quietly changed another person's life. She reached into her purse, unfolded the anonymous note, and placed it on the table between them. Whoever wrote this changed mine too. Adrian looked down at the familiar handwriting before smiling with quiet embarrassment. I hoped you would never discover that. Emily laughed softly through grateful eyes. I think I was meant to. Neither of them spoke again for several peaceful moments. They simply watched the city lights shimmer beyond the window, while the last candle flickered gently across the polished table. Sometimes love did not begin with grand declarations or dramatic moments. Sometimes it arrived disguised as consistency, hidden inside a familiar chair, a single glass of Cabernet Sauvignon, a quiet song at the end of a long day, and two people who reminded each other that dignity, kindness, and hope were still worth returning to every single night.